So a few years ago, Islamic Relief invited me as a researcher based at the University of East London to look at a section of their programming known as domestic programming. And by that they mean the programs that are undertaken in the global north, we might know them as the wealthy countries of the world, working with poor communities in their own countries. And I was asked to look at these bits of work that they call domestic programs. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about the findings, but not in too much detail. I just want to use this as a springboard to reflect on what we mean by international development NGOs, what we mean by development and our expectations of them, and how these programs, these domestic programs, rupture our understandings, disrupt our understandings of what we mean by development. And I'm interested in a lot of my work in things that explode myths, things that rupture our understandings, things that change the way we see things. So Islamic Relief, for those of you who don't know, Islamic Relief Worldwide is now 35 years old. It was begun in 1984 when a group of medics based in Birmingham wanted to have a specifically Muslim response to the East African famine. But it's now an enormous organisation. Its last annual report, for example, was showing you the millions it had raised and the millions of people it had impacted in that 1 year. But it largely is known in the sector as an international NGO or an INGO, which is part of my kind of title. This is where they work. These are the countries they operate in. Notice I'm using the term Islamic Relief Worldwide. There are Islamic Relief UK, there's Islamic Relief in the Palestinian territories, there's Islamic Relief Nepal, there's a whole series of Islamic Relief part of the family. And notice the term partner offices. These partner offices are offices in largely the global north that were set up to fundraise, to raise the money in the rich part of the world so that all of these countries could program their work. And that's kind of what I'm going to be talking about. So I wanted just to reflect on what we mean by development. A lot of people tend to think of the work that Islamic Relief do as addressing the needs of income-poor people. They may think of them working in countries, Muslim-majority countries. They may think of work with humanitarian disasters and man-made disasters in the case of Syria and within the Palestinian context as well. But what I want to argue is that the way in which Islamic Relief work with a domestic programme fundamentally disrupts our notion of what we think of development. Because it changes the way we think about the spaces in which development takes place, the actors of development and the processes in quite an unnerving way, actually. And I like to use this example. I did from some previous research. This is an article from 1994 from the Daily Mail, our old favourite. And it was an article that was written when the news got out that Oxfam was thinking of setting up a UK poverty programme. Outrage, outrage. Stick to the third world, insulting Oxfam told. It kind of rings some bells, doesn't it, with what's happened recently with the arrival of the UN Special Rapporteur, Philip Alston, in the UK and being told, no, we don't have any poverty in the UK. You probably can't read this here, but the editorial, so this was the piece that was in the Daily Mail, then there was an editorial as well, and it says, to the ragged, starving, desperate peoples of Africa, Asia and South America, Oxfam's newfound obligation must look like a sick joke. So this is the way in which development is kind of stereotyped and almost parodied in the popular media, that it's about people over there, distant others, the ragged, starving people of Africa. And I'm interested in this because these domestic poverty programs completely disrupt this idea for us. So I asked this question, why is it important to think about domestic poverty programs now? Why I think are they relevant to even be discussed? And why do I think Islamic Relief is such a brave organisation for having 7 domestic poverty programs in Canada, Germany, Malaysia, South Africa, Sweden, UK, and US. And I would argue there's 4 reasons. In no particular order, I would argue that we realise that domestic poverty is an issue we have to deal with much more, especially since the Syrian migrant crisis. Both Germany and Sweden, for example, saw an uptake of their ODA, that's their Overseas Development Assistance, spent within country, of respectively for Germany 25% and 35% for Sweden. So enormous increases in the amount of ODA spent in country. We've got the case of the Oxfam Haiti scandal. I don't need to go into the details here. Massive lack of trust in international NGOs, the desperate need from the public to feel that they've got something that they can trust, something tangible, something nearer to them that INGOs are doing. The Sustainable Development Goals, signed off by the United Nations in 2015, have a much broader understanding of what we mean by development. There's a universality to it. It applies to all of us. In fact, all 17 goals and 169 targets have been signed up to for all countries, all member states of the United Nations, and including the UK. And then I would argue that cases like the Grenfell Tower disaster or the Flint water crisis in the US have made more visible the inequalities in our own societies. And for these 4 reasons, I think that INGOs, international NGOs, are having to think, should we be responding domestically? Now, I promised that I wouldn't, when I was talking to the organisers, throw too many statistics, and I know it's really late in the day to be doing this, but I just wanted to show that there's a massive scope, and that by doing a piece of research that crosses all the way from Canada, Germany, Malaysia, South Africa, blah, 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 and crossing across enormous different political, geo-economic contexts, and it's very difficult to draw generalizations from those. And I would just draw your attention, for example, to the top line, which is the donation that was made by that Islamic Relief Office to Islamic Relief Worldwide in 2016, all the way from over £25 million being collected in the US to go back into the central pot, down to under £1 million in the case of South Africa. If you look at then the second statistic I've looked at, the percentage of Muslims in the population, massive range. So we're talking about some really very different contexts here. So this is kind of my health warning. I want to ignore that slide. So I identified in my research that there were a number of challenges in having a domestic poverty programme. All 7 of those partner offices are experiencing this. And this is a quotation from one of the beneficiaries of their programmes. I was asked if I knew any dead, radical or dangerous people. They also asked with whom I had been travelling together and with whom I had dealt with. Can you imagine being a beneficiary of an Islamic relief programme and having those questions asked of you? Now, those things happen when you are contracted by a government agency to undertake work on their behalf as an INGO, and this happens in the case of the United States. And I argue that what this does is really challenge Islamic Relief to ask some really difficult questions. How do you frame your domestic poverty programme? Do you keep it under the radar, or do you kind of shout out about it? Do you try and say to people, no, we only work with Muslims, or no, in domestic poverty terms, we work with everybody, and look what good citizens we are as an organisation with the word Islam in it? It's really difficult, and it raises some very difficult questions for them. There's lots we could discuss there, but I'm going to speed over this. Internal strategy tensions. There are 2 very different and binary distinct ways of seeing domestic poverty programmes within Islamic Relief. On the one hand, you've got people who see it as fundamentally a fundraising mechanism. We need to kind of bear in mind that we've got to raise funds, and fundamentally we know that people would much prefer to give for Syria than they would to give for, let's say, ex-Muslim offenders in Lancashire, and that has been an issue before. Islamic Relief actually have been discussing that kind of work. We can discuss that later. There are also those people who see that strategically domestic poverty programme aligns you really well with a number of your own organisational strategic goals and embeds you in the community with which you're working. You get contacts with government, contacts with parliamentarians. So there's real tensions internally. And then there's this tension between the way in which Islamic Relief see poverty and development and understand human well-being and the external perceptions of their own donors, and I mean their individual philanthropic donors, people who give zakat to Islamic Relief. On the one hand, you've got this incredibly intellectually rich resource internally in the organisation that they call the Maqasid framework, which sees human dignity at the centre of everything that they do, part of human well-being. And that allows for you to think about domestic poverty. If dignity is at the heart of what it means to be a human being and the heart of well-being, then why should you not be working with ex-Muslim offenders in Lancashire? And why does that make them any less worthy of your zakat than a Syrian refugee? And I don't mean to say that disrespectfully, but I'm trying to make the point. Contrast that view with this. Now, here's Philip Alston, the UN Special Rapporteur, who visited the UK a few months ago and was accused by our Home Secretary of his report of being extraordinarily political. And I think that says something very profound, and there are many things that I've written in my report about this that make this a little bit more of a sophisticated issue than this image can explain. But I think there's a real contrast with our prevailing understanding of poverty in the UK and its complexity, multi-dimensional form, and this kind of ability to distance it from politics, which I think is deeply problematic, and I believe that it's very problematic for Islamic Relief. One donor from South Africa, I think this is a really interesting just point of reflection about who's important and why is it that we feel some distant others are more worthy of our zakat than others. The issues in Palestine with the Rohingya are a lot more severe. Really interesting. You look at the human development indicators in South Africa, the massive social injustices, and I put my cards on the table here. I've worked in Palestine and I'm married to a Palestinian, but I can see that issues in Palestine are not always the issues that people's money should necessarily be going to, when there may be very pressing issues nearer to home. But there are very real psychological and religious reasons why people feel a sense of solidarity in Palestine. Mm-hmm. So I finish with this kind of external view that doesn't in any way, that I think underpins what I've been trying to say. And this has come from some research done by an ex-Oxfam member of staff, published very recently, last year. Supporter expectations have changed. What the public think INGOs do and what they actually do is different. INGOs themselves have been keen to suggest that solutions are cheap and easy. They have portrayed local people as victims and external agencies are the heroes. And I think that understanding of poverty, that understanding of what we as good citizens, whether it's good Muslims, good Christians, good people of non-faith, how we respond to that it needs to be cheap, quick and easy, is an outrage. And INGOs have to get over that way of portraying poverty alleviation work. If any of you are interested in seeing a little bit more about my research, it's now published on the e-library by the Humanitarian Academy for Development, which is effectively Islamic Relief Worldwide's research and development agency. They have an e-library, and fortunately they've already put it up there. So, thank you very much.